Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Today I'm talking with Heather Hooper and discussing strategy and strategic plans. Heather, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. How are you today?
I am awesome. Thank you for asking. You're actually one of the first few people to ever ask me that question, and I am grateful for that. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So my favorite first question to ask is, what is your superhero origin story?
Oh, my superhero origin story goes back to college, actually. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, as any college kid does. And my dad, unfortunately, got lung cancer and passed away while I was in college, my second year. And I needed an internship, to be honest. And right at that moment, lung cancer was a big part of my life. And so I looked around and did some Googling and actually ended up interning with American Lung Association. And just from there, worked in their development department and got to know the world of nonprofits. And it really piqued my interest. I ended up going and getting a minor in nonprofit studies from NC State, but I just kind of fell in love with the industry, with fundraising, with making a difference and seeing that difference made in the lives of those that we were serving. And so started there. I went and worked for a startup organization that was back in 2007, 2008, and there was a big economic downturn. And so ended up getting laid off and found my way back to the nonprofit sector, where I started an organization, became the first full-time staff person, and kind of have been in the nonprofit industry ever since.
Thank you for sharing that touching story. It's not easy to talk about these kinds of things with your dad, but I'm happy to hear at least you've turned some of that negativity into something positive. You've done something as a result of it, as opposed to letting it define you. You've redefined it in a positive way, maybe is a better way of saying it.
That's right. I mean, after I worked at the Lung Association, there was a group of people, and at that time, they weren't doing as much for lung cancer specifically. It was more asthma and COPD focused, more air pollution focused. So a group of advocates were starting a organization specifically focused to lung cancer. And I became their first full-time staff person and eventually their executive director. But it really did show for me how I could take something so profound and negative in my life and make a huge difference and an impact in that space. And it was very healing for a long time.
That's fantastic. What are you up to these days? How do you currently help in the nonprofit space?
So currently I'm the executive director of Dementia Alliance of North Carolina. We provide support services to caregivers of those living with dementia across the state of North Carolina here in the US. I'm also doing some nonprofit consulting and helping people really operationalize their strategic plan.
Right, which is the topic for today, strategic plans. This is a topic that I think is a really important one. And I've covered it a couple of times before, but I find it such an important aspect of having a nonprofit that it definitely is worth having multiple opinions, multiple angles to it. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, let's just start, fresh. What really are the purpose? What's the functionality of having a strategic plan? Because I know that some organizations try to operate without one, and that works or doesn't work for various reasons. So, what would be the main key points or motivational reasons why a nonprofit should definitely have a strategic plan?
Yeah. So, I think it's meant to set the course of the organization and give you direction for your larger goals or strategies as you move forward. It's that roadmap to get you to your mission and ultimately your vision. Of course, you want to gather the feedback from your constituents, your community, your donors. But the key thing, Alex, that I think people lose sight of is they're not meant to collect dust or be visited only every 3 years. And so many organizations are just visiting them every 3 years, and they're looking at it and they're saying, oh yeah, what we did here, that fits that goal. And oh yeah, this fits that. And that's not effective, right? They should include strategies that are a roadmap of what we want to prioritize, but they also need to be visited more often than every 3 years.
Okay, so it's setting the course, setting the roadmap, and how detailed would that have to be? Is it really just concepts, Or are there certain things that you would want to put in there that can be measured? Like we want to achieve, X dollars in donations or X volunteers, or is there metrics that we should be included in that strategic plan? Or is it more of a concept?
I mean, I think it's a concept. Here's our three big areas, 3 to 5 big areas, but also this is what success looks like. This is the measurable goals. This is how we will know what success looks like. But being able to visit it every so often and saying, this is what needs to change. This is what needs to pivot. I think setting the broad strokes and then revisiting every year, every quarter on the how to get there. I think sometimes we have these strategic plans that are 15 to 20 pages long. And it's completely overwhelming as an executive director to get a plan just handed to you like that. I had a client recently who had done a strategic plan with somebody else, and she came to me in tears because in the first quarter there was about 20 strategies and tactics that she needed to accomplish. And that was not realistic, right? And so really getting real on what can be done is really important.
When you say you define what success looks like, to me, being an engineer, I go for the hardcore metrics. I like numbers and facts.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying as well? Or are you saying, what can you give us some examples of what
Yeah.
success would look like as written in a plan?
For a revenue, let's say fundraising,
Mhm.
and the goal is to increase the organization's revenue. That's your big overall topic. Underneath there, it might be numbers of how much you want to raise in year 1 and year 2 and year 3, or by year 3 you want to have an annual revenue goal of, let's say 1.1 million. Another specific thing of increasing is you want to begin a monthly giving program. You want to increase the diversity of funding streams, hiring a development director. And so whether or not you've done those. They're relatively smart goals, but they give you room in figuring out the how to get there, the how to implement that monthly giving plan. And that's something that you can do by doing quarterly or annual planning. With my staff and the method that I use, I started doing about 4 years ago annual planning. So where we looked at our 3-year strategic goals and we said, what needs to happen in the next 12 months to move us forward on these strategic goals? And then from there, we do quarterly planning. So what needs to happen in the next 90 days to accomplish our goals? And from there, we set rocks every single quarter. And again, we are defining what does success look like underneath these, and they're very measurable, or to the point where if you did it or not.
Okay. So the way that I see things sometimes when it comes to this kinds of approach is there are 3 levels. Highest level is vision, right? It's really
Right.
where you want to go directionally. It really shouldn't change very often, maybe once during your nonprofit's mission, but it's really the long-term gain
Mhm.
direction. Underneath that would be level 2, and that's strategies, which are more defined that help you get to your vision. Like you mentioned, a certain number of dollars per year or a dollar amount after 3 years. And then the third level I usually put is the tactics. And these are very specific, actionable things that you can do and need to do in order to achieve the strategy goals. Like you said, quarterly planning, monthly giving, or starting a monthly giving, starting this. It's very shorter term. They're very precise, and they will hopefully get you to your strategy goals. Would you say that all 3 of those, well, I'm curious to know, first of all, what you think about those 3 levels? And 2, would you say that all 3 should be in that strategic plan, or just level 1 and 2? And the tactics you save for somewhere else?
So I think the first 2 definitely need to be put into the strategic plan, right? You need your vision, you need some strategy. But I think oftentimes where we end up with the 15 or 20-page strategic plans is we get too far into the tactics. Certain brainstorming is really good. We need to know how we're going to get there. But oftentimes that needs to be determined every single year and every single quarter, and revisiting that all over again to really get us to the vision, the roadmap of where we want to go. I think a lot of times we, again, don't revisit what's working, what's not working, our processes. And sometimes if we revisit every quarter or every year, it allows us to adjust and say, you know what, this is happening this year. We didn't account for the fact that it's an election year, or we didn't account for, this external law changing and making a difference in the mission that we serve. So, I feel like getting overly granular is how you end up with 20 tactics for someone to do in a quarter when you're planning out too far in advance.
So if we don't want to get too detailed in the weeds, is there a certain guideline that you typically recommend to nonprofits in that either a number of pages, not to exceed a certain level or number of pages, or a certain level of detail you recommend not going past? Like how do you
Yeah.
put guardrails onto this plan?
So for me, my strategic plan is 4 pages, no more. And it really talks about what is in the next 3 years, what are our goals? What are the programs and services? A little bit about the marketing that we want to do and the people that we want to reach out to. And then from there, I have a annual working plan and quarterly working plans. And so that's where the meat and the detail come in. But again, we're revisiting those through quarterly retreats every single 90 days. And so we're saying what needs to happen in the next 90 days to move the organization forward to accomplish those big goals that we set out for the 3-year strategic plan or 5-year strategic plan.
And when you're reviewing the plan, is there, like, I understand that you have these working plans, which is great, the annual working plan and the quarterly or the working plan. Is it, as you're reviewing it as your strategic plan every quarter or every year, are you making adjustments to it, or are you just referring to it to make sure you're still on the right path? Like, what would be the criteria, I guess, is my question, to say, this isn't working for us anymore, or this plan isn't quite fitting anymore for X, Y, Z reason, based on what we're seeing on a day-to-day operations, and therefore we need to adjust it. Like, I guess the question is it more of a guide that you don't want to touch too often, or is it a guide that you do want to update often based on the feedback and the inputs you have on the recent information?
I think, overall, usually the big goals don't change, right? Like you say, the vision, this is our vision, this is where we want to go. And that doesn't typically change. If we want to, provide support services for those living with dementia and make sure everyone has an increased quality of life, like that's not going to change. For us, one of our big strategic goals is expansion across the state. That's not really going to change, but the how we're going to get there might change. And so the tactics or the strategies might change in how we accomplish that goal. So, of course, if we turned into an economic downturn, and we might need to adjust our goals for fundraising, but typically the big goals don't change. It's how you're going to get there might need to be adjusted. And I think for us, when we have our quarterly retreats or our annual retreats, we're looking at what's working and what's not working. And this gives us the ability to be flexible and agile to make changes as we need to, or discuss issues.
I'm curious to know if you have any examples of things that, because if you have 4 pages, there isn't a lot, but is there anything that shouldn't be, like we talked about, a certain level of detail, of course, should not be there, but anything else that shouldn't be there? Because we're defining the goals, we're defining the vision. Hopefully it can be broken down. It should be able to be broken down at least into these more actionable tactics and working plans. But I'm curious to know if there's something in there that we say, this definitely shouldn't be in there, even though we kind of want to have it. Maybe it should be, somewhere else, or I don't know.
First thing that comes to mind is like a SWOT analysis. Like, what is that really? Like, we want to have that internally, but it doesn't need to necessarily be a big thing in the strategic plan document, that's 20 pages. I think really, for me, unrealistic expectations shouldn't be in there. These ones that, you have every single quarter planned out for the next 3 years, you don't know what's going to happen 8 quarters from now. And so being able to say, hey, here's some ideas that we have, but we really need to do annual planning or quarterly planning to determine what needs to happen first and prioritize. And then also things that get too task oriented or granular being set forth by the board or the people who aren't implementing it, one of the big things that I do is that I include my staff in a lot of this planning. And so they have buy-in and they're the ones implementing it. Now, I know there's different size organizations, and sometimes it is the board doing that work. But for our board is much more of a strategic advisory role. And so getting their buy-in and what needs to happen first and the priorities there in more of that real time.
In a similar vein, are there certain scenarios where you should not necessarily scrap the plan or start again, but are there things like what would be the criteria to say that this doesn't work for us anymore? We need to change this plan. Is it just because is a scenario where the nonprofit tries to make it work, for some reason it fails, and therefore they say, we're done with this. We'll just have to pivot because it's just not working for us. That would be, I guess, one way to do it. But there are other criteria, or maybe you can define that scenario a bit more with examples to say, here are the criteria of having to change the plan.
That's a good question. I think ultimately, if you have a strong vision and know where you're going, it's really scrapping how you're getting there and making sure that everyone's bought in and aligned around how you're going to get there to achieve the goals, to achieve the strategies that you've set forth. I think oftentimes people don't have a plan, and so then they say yes to everything. And so that's more of the scenario where I feel like you absolutely need to readjust and all come together and get realigned around a specific game plan to move the organization forward in a way that's doable within the resources that the organization has, or everyone's on the same page of the resources that the organization needs to obtain to be able to do the work.
You actually called it out. I love the idea of having the plan to decide when to say no to certain things. That you might have an opportunity that you may think is great, but it's not in line with your plan, and therefore maybe you should consider not doing it, even though it's great. Or would you consider or recommend changing the plan to accommodate it? Like, you have to decide, how tightly coupled should you be to this plan, in the idea of we need to maintain our focus, and even if there's some great opportunities coming our way, because it doesn't fit with our plan, we shouldn't look at it for too long.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. We have what's called an issues list, or some people call it a parking lot, and putting things like that on there, that we're not saying no, we're not saying it's not going to ever be a priority, but it might not be a priority right then and there. And so then every single quarter, we revisit that issues list. Sometimes things naturally fall off and aren't a priority anymore. Sometimes things rise to the top and we say, hey, we really need to put some thought or intentionality behind this. We recently in the dementia field, CMS is now going to be covering, so CMS is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare is going to be covering some dementia caregiver support programs. And it's a lot of what we do. And so we had to take some time to say, okay, where do we fit into some of this? And it was very intentional. And that came from our issues list. We knew it was coming up, didn't really fit in with our strategic plan, but we had to take time to see if it was something that we needed to pursue further. And so those types of situations come up, and that is exactly what a issues list or a parking lot is for, and so that we don't lose sight of those things. And so that's really important as well.
I definitely like the idea of having a parking lot, because you're right. What is a good idea or what isn't a good idea today might be a great idea in some future point. So I like the idea of not dismissing it and forgetting about it, but actually having that list somewhere in your back pocket that you can pull out when and if the time is right.
Oftentimes with the issues list, we also capture things that are issues that are systems or process related. And so for us, we say an issue is an issue, whether we name it or not. And if we name it, we have a chance to address it. And sometimes it does end up in that parking lot list for a minute until we can have the capacity to be able to address it. But a lot of times we find that on our issues list or our parking lot, there are systems issues that we need to work through.
When it comes to actually writing this strategic plan, who's doing the authoring? I imagine it's not just the executive director sitting in a booth or sitting in a silo, writing out a list of visions, and then just, coming down and saying, okay, here it is, making a proclamation saying, okay, here you go, here's the plan, everybody follow it. I imagine there's a more of a collaborative effort than just
Yeah.
a one-person show.
Well, I always say with a 3-year strategic plan, the whole board, and my preference, the whole staff, or at least the leadership team, needs to be in on creating the strategic plan. Also, making sure that you have input from your community, whatever that means to your organization. And so being able to take that input and then having a facilitated retreat and making sure that voices are heard, making sure that everyone is coming together and we're building that alignment. And then having a facilitator. A facilitator is so important to being able for everybody in the room to fully participate and making sure that all voices are heard. And so having a facilitator who then can help you transcribe or help you I've been an executive director for a while, and I've definitely, typed out my own strategic plans, but it's been with the assistance of a facilitator who can help to do that. And then from there, making sure you have buy-in from the board and the staff. So, it's definitely a process. It's not something that is done overnight and just by one person.
In regards to the retreat, is that something you do virtually, in person? Do you go to a physical location and for the day or for the afternoon? Can you explain a bit more about how that retreat works when you're building and also revising this plan?
Yeah, so my preference is in person. I think that there's real value in that. And so for my organization, we get together in person. We have done it, of course, over the pandemic. We did it some virtually as needed. We get together every 90 days. And so we're bringing our staff together every 90 days for quarterly planning retreats and annual retreats. But for the 3-year retreat, we can bring them together virtually. I also think small groups and surveys work well for some pre-work. When I facilitate retreats for other people, I am doing both a combination, depending on where they are, of in-person and virtual. But really, as long as voices are heard and you can get alignment around the vision going forward.
And I'm curious because when I think of retreat, I think of like a yoga retreat where you're in an ashram somewhere or some kind of hotel room. Is it something like that? Is it a boardroom? Is it usually at the nonprofit, or do you prefer recommending getting away just to clear your head? Is it a phones off situation, disconnecting? Let's just have a brainstorming session and get through it. Or I'm just curious to know a bit about the mechanics of the retreat as you're doing it.
Alex, you're speaking my language because I'm very tactical. Both. It really depends on the group and what they're most comfortable with. And so I've done them at a retreat center where, it's just a conference room or a big, space where we can have room to move around. I like to have people get up and use sticky notes and brainstorm together and, get into small groups. And so there's a lot of interaction there. And it also helps your team connect, right? You don't often get away. I feel like, especially today, we're used to being on Zoom screens, and there's a time and a place for that. But when we're really trying to get creative, coming together in a space that's very intentional. Now, for me, I'm looking at, what's working, what's not. What are we celebrating that the organization has accomplished? I think there's so much value in celebrating the progress that we've made and the things that we've accomplished. And then what are the things we need to work on? So there's definitely a time and a place for that SWOT analysis that I dogged on earlier. But coming together and then really getting aligned of, okay, what are the 3 to 5 things that need to happen in the next 3 years to move us forward towards that dreaming goal that we've just set? And so I think, whatever scenario that's going to work or whatever environment that will work well for your particular group, don't be afraid to get comfortable and to get outside of the box and, be creative.
So once that's done, you come out with this golden copy of a plan. I
Yeah.
imagine, like you said, you try to get as much buy-in as possible, at least from the board, the staff, the ED, of course, and if possible, the community. let's say there's a few participants who are unable to make it, or there's certain churn that happens over a period of time. Like, how would you recommend generally nonprofits approach the getting the team aligned to this plan? Like, is it a matter of saying, here it is, take it or leave it? I imagine there's people who are not able to attend, don't and won't have much ability to have feedback, at least not in that first version, maybe a future version. But sometimes aligning a team can be challenging. Is
Yeah.
there a way to have people digest it better and get involved and celebrate it, as opposed to having them resist it in some way?
I mean, I think that there's certainly a period of saying, hey, what do you think about this board staff? Is this reasonable? But then when it comes to staff who, in my case, are the ones that are implementing a lot of the strategies, that is when the annual retreats and quarterly retreats become so important, because it becomes a way of doing business. And it's gotten to the point where my staff, I started it 4 years ago with this consistent, we're getting together every 90 days to work on the business instead of in the business. And, we're going to look at, this is the direction that the board set. Hey, and I'm constantly reminding the board. So as we have new board members, they're always in our board orientation. Hey, this is our strategic plan. We go through it in detail. This is where we are with it. But going back to the staff, we're really consistently looking at it and saying, like, okay, what needs to happen in the next year and the next 90 days? I've been very fortunate to not have a ton of turnover, but I know that that does happen. And so when we've grown and had new staff members come on, they usually get the hang of the cadence by the first, second, third quarter that they're with us, and they've gotten to the point where they are now looking forward to it. And I know that sounds crazy, looking forward to a strategic planning retreat or annual or quarterly retreat, but it allows them to have really focus, and allows them to really know what their priorities are for the next 90 days and what they're working for. With us, each person owns a rock. And so they're responsible for making sure that the rock gets done. They don't have to do everything that it's going to require for the rock, but they are responsible for ensuring that it gets done. So there's some accountability there. An example of a rock right now is we're coming up with some training, and we need to, this quarter, launch the training. And so we have someone that's in charge of making sure that all the elements of that launch get done. So that's just an example.
What I can tell you is I can be bribed by food. So if you have like food at this retreat, I'll be looking forward to these annual and quarterly reviews as well.
We always have.
It's not a far-fetched to have people looking forward to it, especially if you got, fantastic food.
Yeah, no, I think the team connection elements and the food for sure are key.
And then I imagine, you said, you mentioned that you don't have too much churn, which is awesome and rare these days. But if there is churn in the nonprofit, do you recommend generally, as part of the onboarding process for new staff members, to look at and review the plan? Or is it that they will get aligned to it at the next annual or quarterly retreat?
That is such a good point, Alex. Absolutely. As a part of our staff orientation, they're given the documents, they're given where we are, and both for the strategic plan, the 3-year strategic plan, and what the goals are for that year and that quarter. And so that is such a big part of our onboarding. Another thing that I didn't mention in there, but I think is really key, is in our 4-page strategic plan, front and center are our values and the values of the organization. And so every single quarter, as we're looking at our planning, we go over our values and make sure that we're, as a team, as a staff, are still aligned to those values. As we have our board application, we give them our values, and they are asked which one they identify with the most, because we want people who align with our values and that share the same values, that have the right skill sets, and are in the right seat. And so I think that that's another thing that we need to make sure as nonprofit leaders that we're communicating often is our values as an organization.
Because again, I'm an engineer and I like systems and processes. I'm curious to know, as a nonprofit is growing and building new systems and processes, I imagine there's an opportunity there to also make sure that as you're building that out, it is in line with the plan. And I'm curious to know if there's any tips or recommendations you have to say, but let's say I love CRMs. Let's talk about a CRM, right? You're thinking about implementing a new type of CRM. You've got certain choices available to you. Are those the kind of moments where you should also look at the plan to see if the choices will help or the plan will help you make the choice? Or is it those two things separate as long as that CRM is fulfilling the tactical, the level 3 goals, then you don't have to worry about looking at the higher levels?
Well, I mean, I think, usually we name what's working and what's not working. And sometimes it ends up being for us something that's not working as a system. We recently updated our CRM and we realized that it was level down, level 3 for you in your tactics, but we wanted to increase our major donors and we wanted to start a planned giving, program. And we realized that our CRM was not set up well and not being utilized well. We didn't have the resources in place. And so we would be able to get the data that we needed to grow our, larger goal, to meet the larger goal if we had a system in place that was better serving the organization. And so by doing that, we replaced our CRM and it went well, and we're able to pull better data out to fulfill that larger goal. So I think that's definitely a tactic, but we had to be, was that set out in the original strategic plan of saying like, oh, we want to replace our CRM? No, it was us going through and saying, okay, how are we going to get there? What's working? What's not working? In our overall strategic plan, it was make sure that our systems support, increasing our development efforts. Okay, within that, okay, what does that really mean? We're going to look at our systems and the CRM as a part of that.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me as well because they feed each other, but you have to make sure that the system does support what you're trying to achieve, and if it doesn't, it's an opportunity to find something else that hopefully will. What about processes? When I mean processes, I mean more like people doing certain workflows, right? It's not a system situation. It's more like, okay, in order to accomplish this, I as a person needs to do this, then this, then this, and then if this happens, then I do that. I see it as I'm again going back to that technical part. There's a swim lane they're called. Like imagine a pool. You've got those swim lanes, and then sometimes one person needs to do something in their own lane, and then when they've accomplished something, they have to hand it off to somebody else in their own lane. They need to do something and then maybe hand it back to the first person. That to me is a typical process. And I'm curious to know if those kinds of things, because that is also important to document. It's important to understand so that people know, what is their inputs and outputs. How do they know when to start something? How do they know when to hand something off? Do these kinds of things typically change, or how do these things typically change with a proper plan?
Well, I think it's not so much in the plan, but it's in revisiting it every single quarter. And by doing that, you're identifying these issues before they become big issues. You're saying, hey, this isn't working for me. And you're giving a safe place to name the issue, identify it, discuss what works for everyone, and then solve for it. And so we call that IDS in my world. So identify, discuss, and solve, and really get down to that root issue of communicating in a way that's respectful and that takes everyone's opinions and perspectives and strengths in place. I think there's a lot of times where processes don't work, or we don't realize that a process isn't working and our staff realizes it, and we're building a culture of being able to speak up and say, hey guys, this form isn't working for me, and this is why. What can we do to solve this? And then you're documenting it, and then everyone is following it. So I think you're solving for it, but then you're documenting it and it's followed by all. And that's the key, is followed by all, and being able to make sure that people are onboarded and trained correctly and that sort of thing. But it really starts with, sometimes I feel like we get in our feelings about issues or process breakdowns and we blame each other. And it's like, there's no blaming. And as we created a safe space for sharing what's not working, we can take some of the feelings out of it and say, this isn't working. Can we look at it a different way? I value your input on this. Can we discuss and find a better solution? And so my staff has now gotten very good at that, to say, even between quarterly retreats, hey guys, this isn't working. Can we take a minute at the staff meeting and discuss this? And it's really been really good for the health of the team.
Awesome. I don't have any comments on that. I agree with everything you just said. So I'm going to just move to the next question. Future trends. I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts about, maybe at a more higher level, strategic planning changed in the past, a recent past. Maybe more with COVID, for example, or maybe things are more digitized than they were in the past. And the trend going forward into the future. Like, do you see, I don't know if AI is helping or hindering in some way or influencing the trend. I'm just curious to know if you had a crystal ball, what would you predict for the future in terms of planning?
I do think that we have to become more, I guess, agile is the word, flexible, to be able to change quickly. This world is so fast and things change and technology changes. I would like to see strategic plans become shorter and revisited more often. I think that also, including more DEI and access initiatives, and hopefully started taking into account our younger generations and what they have to offer. I think also the ethical use of AI is going to play a big role in just being on everyone's radar, not only for making sure that organizations have professional development in AI, but also how we integrate it into our business to become more efficient with the systems and processes piece. So I think all of that has to do, that might be just nonprofits in general, but those are some trends that I think are pretty accurate.
Any other points you'd like to mention as we're looking to wrap up? Just things that you were thinking of maybe along the way that you said, it'd be nice if, or I want to make sure people remember this part.
So, I think, having a good plan and having a plan that's revisited often, it really does allow alignment for our team. It allows us to focus and execute. Issues become addressed, and we are making progress towards the mission. And really, that's all what it comes down to. Are we serving the mission in the best way that we can?
Awesome. Lots of great information today, Heather. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm hoping you can share ways that people get in touch with you in case they have some follow-up questions.
Absolutely. I can be found on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. And it's just Heather Hooper, Hooper.
Awesome. Heather, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.